thank you so much for joining us all today for the closing weekend of Contagion. Contagion is Science Gallery Bengaluru's first fully digital exhibition season. We've been running since the end of April, and we're now coming to the close of phase two of Contagion. Science Gallery Bengaluru is a new institution for public engagement with research. Our aim is to bring science back into culture by bridging the gap between research and the public. Contagion will be closing on the 31st of December 2021. So we'd like to encourage all of you to please have a look at the exhibition before it goes dark. Now, today's event is a very special event for us and one of the very first performances that we've had at a Science Gallery exhibition. We were very lucky to be able to have the first Indian screening and showing of the Contagion Cabaret. And before we get into the exciting discussion ahead of us, I'd like to introduce the audience to the performance by sharing a short preview into it.
I don't mind what you need. It just takes a lot out of me.
Are you looking? Are you not?
Tell me, what wisdom have
you got?
I can see everything. It's like all at once in some dream state.
I am looking all the time.
How can nothing feel so divine? We're all living in some mad world, and it's only getting stranger every day. And that's the truth. We're living in this sad world. It's no wonder that you tell me you're afraid.
And so for all those of you who haven't yet had a chance to see the full performance, please do see it. It will be up on our website until the 31st of December. And it is quite a fascinating thing to see. So I think we'll just realize how much so in the discussion coming up. And for that, I'd like to start by introducing the fascinating people we have with us today from across very, very diverse disciplines and walks of life. So I'd like to start by introducing John Terry. John is the artistic director of Chipping Norton Theatre, a small independent producing theatre in the UK. He has previously been a member of the National Theatre Studio Directors Programme, associate director of the Finborough Theatre, staff director for the National Theatre, and an associate artist for the National Youth Theatre. He has led the theatre Chipping Norton since 2008 as the artistic director, reinventing the venue as a producing house for small and mid-scale work. John's productions for the Chipping Norton include the Kreutzer Sonata, The Island, and national and international tours of Around the World in 80 Days, and Stones in His Pockets, Skylights, and Jeeves and Wooster in Perfect Nonsense. Along with John from Chipping Norton Theatre, we have Anna Tolput. Anna is an actor, director, and acting tutor. Her theatre credits include Connie Scolander, 12th Night, King Lear, As You Like It, The Tempest, Spring Storm, and Fahrenheit 45, among others. Her film and television credits include Two Heads Creek, Bun Dolls, The Duck, films with Rob House, and Hellraiser Hellworld, among others. Now, to introduce one of the lead behind this entire project, Professor Sally Shuttleworth. She is a senior research fellow at St. Anne's and a professor of literature at the University of Oxford. This year, she has been named a commander of the Order of the British Empire for her services to English literature. She has published extensively on the interrelations of medicine, science, and culture, and between 2014 and 19 ran the large ERC research project, Diseases of Modern Life, the 19th Century Perspectives, as well as the AHRC project, Constructing Scientific Communities, Citizen Science in the 19th and 21st Centuries, in partnership with the Natural History Museum, London, the Royal Society, and the Royal College of Surgeons in England. Her most recent books are the co-authored Anxious Times, Medicine and Modernity in 19th Century Britain, and the co-edited volume Science Periodicals in 19th Century Britain, Constructing Scientific Communities. She is currently Treasurer and Vice President of the British Academy. We're very happy and very privileged to have Sally here with us today. We'd also like to introduce to you two very interesting respondents who will be sharing their thoughts with us about the Contagion Cabaret. As you would all know, Gagandeep Kaur, she is a professor of microbiology at the Wellcome Trust Research Laboratory and the Division of Gastrointestinal Sciences at the CMC Vellore. She has also been the face of vaccination in India during the COVID-19 crisis. With her team, she conducts interdisciplinary research on enteric infections and child health. She has worked on gut infections in children, focusing on issues of nutrition, water, and sanitation. She has built a team that does everything from geographic information systems to human immunology. They have also evaluated vaccines in preclinical and clinical phase 1 to 3 studies for rotavirus, cholera, and are now working on typhoid and SARS-CoV-2. I'd also like to introduce Teja Verma Pusapati. She is an assistant professor in English at Shiv Nada University, India. She studied at the Universities of Delhi and Oxford. She has held a Torch Women in Humanities Writing Fellowship at the University of Oxford, an Andrew Mellon Fellowship at the Huntington Library in California, and is currently on the board of directors of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals. She works on Victorian literature and culture with a specific focus on gender and the periodical press. Her articles have appeared in Victorian Periodicals Review, Women's Writing, and 19th Century Gender Studies. Her first monograph on the rise of Victorian women's political journalism is forthcoming with Routledge. In her teaching and research, she aims to examine the striking ability of print culture to shape our understanding of time and timeliness, the momentary, and the historical. And finally, I'd like to welcome the chair of today's session, who will be guiding this amazing group in a very interesting discussion, Raghavendra Gargakkar. We are very lucky to have him, to be working with him at Science Gallery. He heads an active school of research at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. He used the little-known eusocial wasp, Rhopalidea marginata, for his original research. The wasp has helped his team showcase new ecology-centered perspectives on the evolution of social lives in animals. This year, the Animal Behavior Society has named him their 2021 Distinguished Animal Behaviorist for an outstanding lifetime achievement in the study of animal behavior. So now with this extremely distinguished panel from very, very different fields of study, we are hoping to see how we might think about this amazing performance that we've all watched. Raghavendra, I'd now like to hand over to you, and we look forward to this session.
Thank you very much. It's a real privilege to be part of this wonderful group and to have the opportunity to participate in one more event of the Bengaluru Science Gallery, which is a wonderful new kid on the block here. We've not had anything like that before, and it's just amazing what they have been able to do in the short time and in the lockdown period. So it's really quite a wonderful experience. So without spending any more time, I'd like to invite the panelists to share their views. I'd like to begin by inviting Professor Sally Shuttleworth to sort of give us the origin and the conception of the film, whose clip we just saw. Sally?
Thank you very much. Well, first I'd like to start by thanking the Science Gallery. We're just been delighted, I think, to be part of the programme for your superb exhibition on Contagion. It's wonderfully inventive and thorough. So to give a brief history of our own Contagion Cabaret, it started off as a live stage performance in 2017 and 18. And we first performed in the Oxford History of Science Museum in a wonderful historic building where the basement where we performed was the original anatomy theatre of the university, so very atmospheric. We also performed in various other venues such as the Science Museum in London. The origins of the Contagion Cabaret date back to my Diseases of Modern Life project, which was funded by the European Research Council. And what this did was look at the social, psychological and environmental impacts in the 19th century of what they conceived of as modernity. So overwork, stress, but also environmental pollution and the origins of public health movements, and indeed the beginnings of epidemiology, which, as we can see now, is exceedingly important in our lives. Now, in the UK, we're encouraged to take research to the widest possible public. And I'd had a growing interest in Contagion for my other project, the Citizen Science in the 19th and 21st century. We'd run an exhibition at the Royal College of Surgeons of England in London, Vaccination, Medicine and the Masses, in which we trace not only the history of vaccination, but also, very importantly, the history of the anti-vaccination movement, which was huge in the 19th century. And I think casts huge light on vaccine hesitancy today. And we ran a whole range of events around that exhibition, including anti-vaccination songs of the 19th century, but not theatre. Now, I am a great believer in the immediacy and the emotional power of theatre. And I counted ourselves hugely fortunate to be able then to work with Chipping Norton Theatre. What they produced for our Contagion Cabarets are based on the research of the project has been absolutely wonderful, I think, involving the audience, but also making them think. We gave the idea of contagion, the widest possible remit, so contagion of ideas as well as physical forms of contagion. And we wanted to involve medics as well as, so it wasn't simply about medicine, but it was also had medical voices within. So it was a fast-paced production with song, drama and talks from medics and other academics. Now, at that point, we had in Britain had sort of been the experience of SARS and MERS and, of course, HIV, which figured quite strongly in our Contagion Cabaret. But it was all still probably, I think, at a comfortable distance until COVID struck. And the world, I think, it's not an overstatement to say the world changed. And the relevance of what we'd done in Contagion Cabaret seemed absolutely compelling. Particularly, I think, the historical record, which so often just seems to be forgotten. And we behave as if this is the first time the world has ever faced a massive pandemic. Clearly not. But we had no record, really, other than a few stills and a very low quality video of one of our performances. And so I was hugely fortunate to be able to get a grant from Oxford University, Rapid COVID Response Fund, which allowed us to turn our original production into a film so that we could actually take it out to the world rather than small audiences. But I should say, this came with huge logistical problems, not least the fact that the Rapid Response Fund was actually very, very rapid indeed. And I think we had probably 6 weeks from getting the money to actually producing the final thing. And as you will have seen, if you've watched the production, John and his team were just amazing in what they managed to produce in that time, and the creative response and the ways in which they overcame the logistical problems of how you actually produce a film in full lockdown. So I turn now to John and Anna to talk about the challenges that they faced in producing the film.
Thank you, Sally. Yes, so we will now turn to John Terry to give us his take on the production of this film. John?
Thank you, Raghavendra, and hello, everybody. Greetings from Oxfordshire. Yeah, I mean, I have a feeling today that I felt really every time we've approached this project, which is feeling a little bit like the group of players in Hamlet when they turn up at Claudius's court, surrounded by kings and statespeople and great thinkers. And here we are as a sort of group of ragtag jesters come along to add our tuppence worth. And I think that was our feeling right from the beginning with this. You know, Sally's research and her team's work around these subjects were incredibly impressive, and it was a daunting task to see how we might add something to that. But I suppose we came at it very green. To us, this was certainly in 2017, and with due respect and apologies to all present, it was quite an obscure topic. And you know, it was a challenge for us to sort of work out how we could try and bridge that out to the wider public. And we started off talking about the idea of perhaps we could have some readings of some plays about contagious diseases and things like that. But at a certain point, this rather silly idea of a cabaret about contagious diseases emerged, and Sally was, perhaps to our surprise, very, very enthusiastic about this idea and what might come of it. So working with her and her team, working with other researchers from the university and doing our own research and exploration and going through our own bookshelves and cupboards, we came up with an enormous amount of raw material that we then had to sort of find a way of shaping. As Sally has already said, it was originally a live performance, and in fact what you have watched on screen is I think now its 8th incarnation as a project, but it suddenly became broadly relevant in this extraordinary way when the pandemic hit. And it seemed to us as a theatre, you know, our business primarily is gathering groups of people together in usually quite warm and airless rooms to have a communal experience. And so we were really quite, our hands and legs were tied quite firmly in terms of what we were able to do and our normal creative practice. But I think Sally and I both agreed that it would be criminal to not find a way of taking the Contagion Cabaret in some form to speak to what was happening in the world around us. It was created relatively soon to the beginning of the pandemic and lockdown. As Sally has said, it was quite a quick turnaround. And this meant that we were very much sort of learning on the job in terms of how to technically achieve this. And perhaps Anna can say something in a minute about the experience of being part of a process, acting in what is in effect sort of an ensemble show, when every single person involved is in a different building, often in a different county, and sometimes not even working at the same time as each other. So that drew its own challenges, but also, as with any kind of creative limitations, we started to see some green shoots of interesting ideas there that might lead to something that was expressive in itself. But I think also, of course, what it threw up was, how does this material sit in a world that is very scared and uncertain about its future? Some of the jokes that perhaps we had been making in the Contagion Cabaret in the previous years, we had to work out if they were funny anymore, if they were relevant, how that would land. So the project has had, as well as different incarnations, it's had very different audiences and very different worlds that have received it during that time. certainly for us as creatives, it was really exciting and quite humbling to, for example, produce a scene from Commissioner Angels in America about the 1980s, 90s AIDS epidemic, and then have that followed up by a talk on the, absolute most up-to-the-minute AIDS treatments from one of the UK's leading AIDS researchers. It was quite daunting to feel that we were adding something to that mix. But I think in our naivety and our perhaps innate silliness, we were able to sort of bring a different light and a different flavor to mix in with some of the extraordinary research on display. But yeah, I might hand over to Anna, who of course had a very different experience. I believe she's in a dressing room today about to go into a performance of pantomime, such as An Actor's Life. But it was quite an interesting and unusual experience, which I think in some ways reflected the isolation and loneliness that a lot of people were going through in the lockdown. Over to you, Anna. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, you need to.
I'm embarrassed to realise, of course, that I'm now just about to run out of battery as well. So I'm moving to a different part of the day. Please forgive me. Yeah, it was an incredible experience, and I think, as John's already sort of expressed, it evolved as a project, probably as much as COVID itself has evolved, and each time we had to sort of find a different reason, a different take on it, I guess, a different reason for why we were doing it. And it initially started off, it was using the idea of cabaret and sort of underground, deviant internal world of that sort of theatrical internal world. And we played that. So we had the MC character who I played, who would make jokes about, if any of you audience have brought anything with you, please do share it around and things like that. It was all very, and then suddenly we weren't allowed to do it with an audience anymore. So that was it was entirely completely turned on its head. And we started to think, well, the deviant world now feels like it's the external world. That's the world that we're not allowed to go into anymore. So we stuck the MC out in the middle of a huge field, and everybody else was locked up in their bedrooms, putting together their bits of the cabaret from where they were. And we had some ingenious people like the music director and our editor as well, Richard Nozzle, managing to splice together two voices so that they the songs more or less worked as if we were all singing it together. But I think it also had a real sense of camaraderie about it. It was a point it was very close to the beginning of lockdown. We were all scared. We were terrified for lots of reasons, but not least of which was the future of theatre seemed really uncertain, and still does. And it was just a moment of us all doing a project together at a time when it was really hard to do that. So I have a huge amount of love for the project, and actually watching it again today made me feel a bit tearful, because it was incredibly important to us at the time. I don't know if I've actually answered any of that question, but those are my thoughts.
Thank you. We now have two respondents coming from very different backgrounds, and I think they perfectly complement each other. Maybe we should begin with Dr. Gagandeep Kang, who is a professor of microbiology, who knows about the disease and the pandemic orders of magnitude more than any of us. Gagandeep.
Thank you. I have to say I loved watching the film. And then when I was reflecting on what it must have taken for all of you to think about it and to put it together, and to pick out pieces of literature, to pick out what kinds of songs you were going to sing and the skits, it just made me feel hopeful about the world. Anna touched on the camaraderie. I have to say, quoting from this, I was prodigiously smitten by the entire film. So And the reason for that is, if you read literature, and Sally and Teja know way more about this than I do, but I'm a microbiologist and I read a lot. And the story of pandemics, specifically of infectious diseases, used to be very well told. And the last one that we've told well is the story of AIDS. And perhaps it's because it was something that affected the more creative communities more than anyone else. Then I got to reflecting on who was telling the story and how complete the picture was, whether it is the readings or the songs. And I realized that a lot of the world gets left out. Their stories aren't told. And we don't have a similar approach to bringing together people who have experienced a pandemic or have experience of...
Nothing's playing at the moment.
Sorry, that's my phone talking to you. But there are so many theater traditions in Indian culture that would lend themselves so well to be able to tell, to put together an ensemble like this that would be tremendously valuable for us to think about. So in a way, you're pathfinders. You've shown us what is possible. And in one way of thinking about it is the world sort of fell apart. Everybody was in their own fragment, their own piece of the world. And what you've done through this effort is bring people together and have them face the same things externally and think about looking perhaps in the same direction, but from slightly different points of view. And I hope that this would be something that other organizations and people could take up and do. And then I have lots of other ideas around infectious diseases that you could think about. So I'll stop there and hand back to Dr. Gadadkar.
Thank you, Gagandeep. Now I will request Teja, who will give us will come from a very different perspective. I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. You must unmute yourself, Teja.
Yes, thank you, Raghavendra and Sally, for this wonderful opportunity to talk about the film. This actually was a rewatching for me because I'd watched it first at a very different point when it first came out around June 2020 on YouTube. And in India at the time, we had sort of recently come out of the lockdown, which for us, of course, was marked by a massive migrant labor crisis. And there was what spoke to me then about the film was that the medical story of the pandemic is sort of very, very closely intertwined with the social, cultural, historical, literary, and that the experience of the pandemic is going to be very different depending on your location of class, gender, caste, national, and regional location. And it was also, I remember, the pre-vaccine phase. So it was very interesting to rewatch it for this discussion in a post-vaccine world where it looks like much has changed, but also very much hasn't. And so many of those concerns sort of remain. Vaccines exist, but remain beyond the reach of millions. And of course, I was watching this with the in the aftermath of the second wave, which was marked for those of us in India with catastrophic loss, much of it very personal, and of course the virus itself, which keeps changing, and Gagandeep will know better than anyone about this, and we all sort of look to her to explain what is going on with it every day. But it remains unknown. And so what I wanted to bring to this discussion was this incredible. So even as we know more than we did before, it remains alien, unknown, and therefore also profoundly frightening. So I just sort of thought I would speak about 3 sections that really sort of stood out for me when I was watching this, which were sections on fear, pathological fear, and by definition seem extreme and therefore disconnected from our everyday experience. But also I think the film makes it, sort of allows us to recognize that we've all had a brush with this in the last 1.5 years. And, so I thought, we thought we'd share clips about, and sort of so that the audience could also get a sense of the film and what it offers. So I wanted to sort of pull up a clip from Jerome K. Jerome's 3 Men in a Boat, 1889, which talks about an experience that I think all of us in one way or the other have had, which is one of hypochondria. So if you could just sort of play that, and then I'll...
I remember going to the British Museum one day to read up the treatment for some slight ailment of which I had a touch. Hay fever, I fancy it was. I got down the book and read all that I came to read. And then, in an unthinking moment, I idly turned the leaves and began to indolently study diseases, generally. I forget which was the first distemper I plunged into, some fearful, devastating scourge, I know. And before I had glanced half down the list of symptoms, it was borne in upon me that I had fairly got it. I sat for a while, frozen with horror, and then in the listlessness of despair, I again turned over the pages. I came to typhoid fever, read the symptoms, discovered that I had typhoid fever, must have had it for months without knowing it, wondered what else I had got, turned up St. Vita's dance, found, as expected, that I had that too, began to get interested in my case, and, determined to sift it to the bottom, started alphabetically.
So I thought that one of the things that worked for me throughout the film was kind of these astonishing resonances across history, because this, for example, is just astonishingly, it parallels the contemporary practice of Googling, which all of us have sort of been guilty of, much to the chagrin of doctors who say, don't do it. But, because you look up a disease and of course you feel like you have it. And sort of this encounter with an available form of knowledge also inducing anxiety, literally making one sick with worry. And it was really interesting to me that the film sort of makes a connection, I think, between this form of fear and social, and how it can potentially make you vulnerable to paranoia, which is a form of social, which has devastating social, political consequences. And I was really interested in how that link was made between a subject of hypochondria being ripe for paranoia. So if you could just quickly pull up the clip from the Arena magazine, again, 1894, a magazine in 1894 making that connection between the two. And I'll sort of talk about that if you could. Could you please pull up the one on the Arena magazine? It's called A New Disease.
Relentless hate is on the poor fellow's track. It's a well-known fact that when a man is in a condition ripe for suggestion, he accepts the thought of another. So paranoia is often known to have its beginnings in the suggested hate of someone else.
Sorry, I was just thinking that, I mean, one of the things that the film makes very clear is just how important the language in which we talk about disease is. And I was thinking of Dr. Emily Taylor Perry's portion in the film, where she outlines, for example, the history of the 19th century cholera epidemic, of which there were several instances in Europe. but was increasingly associated, actually predominantly associated with India and China, and was discussed as a disease of empire, which of course then feeds the imperial discourse. And again, there are these astonishing sort of resonances between, and that's noted in the film, between that and the way in which this particular pandemic is seen as a Chinese disease, and words such as Wuhan virus or even Kung flu, and that language like this has real world consequences, such as, I mean, it's noted in the film that is sort of the anti-Asian hate crimes have gone up by 21% in England since the break of the pandemic. And I was thinking about what this alerts us to, which is that the language of medicine can, if we're not careful, then become a pretext for other forms of fear and hatred, which of course the Paranoia piece sort of identifies very clearly. I just wanted to sort of, there was a way in which the film was so topical when I'm thinking of the two viewings, in that it comes off the moment, but also that it seems to be a particular kind of moment in that it has begun, but a definitive end doesn't seem to be in sight. So we seem, and I think that comes across very powerfully in the sections on how people feel imprisoned, or even the term lockdown, which sort of evokes that idea of imprisonment. And in a way, I was thinking that the film sort of also then looks backwards, but also, and I think Gagandeep also was rightly, and I completely agree, there's this way in which the film sort of opens out into the future as well. So it talks about a certain kind of event which had a start and doesn't seem to have an end in sight, but also sort of thinks of a new way of life. And I think for me, that came across very powerfully in the portion on Benjamin Ward Richardson, which Sally speaks about, which is imagining the new kind of city, a city with many of the things that we think about, a more livable city, thinking of ways in which we can live with each other in better ways. And in that sense, sort of the film also offers a way out of the moment, a way out of the sense of being imprisoned within this. I just wanted to end with two questions that I thought we could sort of, think about. One was, the sense of whether the experience of the pandemic changed the process of researching and writing about this for the researchers on the project. The second is for both Anna and John, I was wondering, exactly as I think both of you mentioned, about how the experience of performance changes fundamentally, public performance changes fundamentally in the course of the pandemic. But also, I was wondering, so there were two things. There was this wonderful moment in the film, Anna, when you're standing in front of a bridge and a cyclist sort of video bombs, and, it's a real meta moment in the film. And it also sort of introduces this sense of, I found myself wondering, there's real risk that you took, physical risk in making this film. And there's a certain physical risk that you're taking in practicing putting up a public performance. So I was thinking about, how did you think of risk? Because one of the things that I think was really powerful was the need to balance the risks of solitude and loneliness with the risks of contagion, and also the risk of being too close to this kind of material. Maybe something just felt too close for comfort. Did you have to sort of want to just move away from that for a bit? So these were the questions that I had for you. Thank you very much.
Before
Thank
John
you.
takes more, sorry.
Thank you, Teja. Yeah, I think we have plenty of time, and I think it'll be wonderful for the panelists to talk to each other in public view, so to speak. So Teja has already asked some questions to John and Anna and to Sally. It'd be wonderful if you can respond to that. And I have a question later on for John, but please, Anna, you wanted to say something. Please go ahead.
I was just very quickly going to say that that cyclist happened, and the editor tried and beautifully blanked it out, managed to take it out of the film. And both John and I said, no, put it back in.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it was really, I think at that point in time, it was really good for us to be able to talk to the moment as artists, and it felt very healing to be creating something, and therefore I don't think we, on our own behalves, shied away from it too much. But there was definitely content that we didn't include that had been included in previous versions, that felt like it was just the wrong moment to land things like that. I think it's interesting talking about the moment in time, because I think it's very true that these things go differently at different moments in time. Our Christmas show at the moment is a production of Rapunzel, which was actually rescheduled from last year. But of course, we find ourselves putting on a very light-hearted production about a girl locked in a tower for 18 years, which has sort of come to seem sort of bizarrely topical. And so these things often have a way of ringing true to the moment in unexpected ways.
Sally, did you want to respond? Yes.
Yes. I think we were so aware of how to be sensitive to at the time, because I do know various academic friends who did not want to watch the Contagion Cabaret just because of its title. And the sense that things was just so grueling, the notion that you would actually sit down and watch something that appeared to be completely irreverent and amusing just seemed wrong to them, even though they believed in the radical power of theatre. So that was really interesting for me. And one element that we lost that I was sad about, but I can see why. It's the scene from the play about Eyam. Now, this was absolutely central for me because I grew up near Eyam, which is a little village in Derbyshire. And in the 17th century, plague was brought into the village on some cloth, and they made the extraordinary decision that they would remain enclosed to stop the spread. And if you go to Eyam now, you can still see all the plaques on the houses down the main street. It's extraordinary, saying who died in this house. So it was, for me, a sort of a very formative experience. And one of the scenes in the play is the two lovers separated at the boundaries of the village, and the young man wanting to break through, and the young woman saying, no, we have to be isolated. And the decision was taken that actually, because the young were feeling utterly isolated and unable to see their partners at that point, actually this was probably just too poignant at the time. I don't know if we want to look at a clip, any clips from the film.
Yes, there is time if we want to look at any clip. Yes, we have time.
Should we just look at, first of all, Anna introducing everything in your cornfield with your gas mask?
Okay, yeah.
And then maybe the Eyam. Yes.
This is cozy, isn't it? Welcome to the Contagion Cabaret. Catchy, yeah? What you're about to see is all about sharing. But here we are, locked down, socially distanced, marooned in our grotty back bedrooms. So we're going to have to pass around our dirty little secrets through the medium of film. Why don't you get really close to the screen? See if you can't catch something. I present for you a feast of disease from throughout the ages. The tastiest morsels of plagues past and present, because, yes, ladies and gentlemen, we have all been here before. So come on, Pop your little face masks on, 2 meters apart. Let's begin.
Sorry, if I could just
Yeah.
say something that just sort of struck me about Anna's performance throughout the film, which was that it's a strange, the persona is not trying to be liked. And I thought that was really interesting, especially if you're going to put in a film like, which is going to talk about a difficult experience. So I was really very curious about the way in which it toys with the persona sort of toys with the audience. And there are parts where you sort of, it almost gets comforting. And, there are other sections where you say, well, but, there's this other part, and then you bring in another piece, which is actually talking about difficult experience. So I was thinking about the voice, Anna, and how you approach that.
Yeah, it was quite a strange experience, and it was very much an experiment to be very, very intimate in the way I was speaking, but very much at odds with where I was, and we sort of played with that idea, partly because I don't think we didn't want the character to come across as a TV presenter, which could happen, just presenting, oh, here's the it had to be something a bit strange, a bit, again, the hangover of the idea of the MC, the sort of deviant MC, the underground thing had to be there. I also think it occurred to us that this character was perhaps the virus. And I know it's a little bit, and it was creating, in that way, again, that creates a bridge between an audience and between the action that was in there as well. So it is strange, and it is quite alienating, and I'd like to say that was deliberate.
I was just going to add something about this idea of stories that are left out. Firstly, to reflect on a discussion that most of us on the panel had about 10 days ago, when we sort of met together to sort of talk about some of the things that we might discuss today, and it was very clear, certainly in the UK and I think in India as well, that we wouldn't really know what was quite the right tenor of the discussion until we got to today. That the world, still 18 months after this film was made, was so uncertain that 10 days, a delay of 10 days, could put an entirely different colour onto the context in which we were discussing this. And I found that very striking, that we should still be like you say, Teja, we're in a post-vaccine world, and so much has changed, and yet the degree of uncertainty and temporality is still extreme. Certainly running a theatre and a producing theatre, we are very much moving 24 hours at a time at the moment, and every time my phone buzzes, I jump out of my skin, assuming that it's somebody else who's got a case and we're going to have to cancel another show or send everybody off to get tested, and so on and so forth. But this idea of stories being left out, I certainly really wanted to kind of assert and remind everybody that watches it that not only was this created at a very particular moment in time, it was created from a very particular place and in the context of the UK and the situation that we were in at the moment. Gagandeep, I'm thrilled at the idea that perhaps artists and researchers and scientists in India might take the idea, the structural idea of what we created, and make it anew for a different context. But I would be very interested to hear over the course of this discussion from panelists and perhaps from others watching how the film reads from a very different place in the world that has had a very different journey and a different encounter with this singular event in our times. Because I think there are a lot of stories left out, not least stories beyond the UK and beyond English literature.
Gagandeep, did you want to say something?
Yes, sure. So the things that I wanted to focus on was uncertainty, and how, you have this character talking about the plague and sitting by the window and waiting for the sound of trains or familiar treads, uh, harking back to a time when you could predict what was likely to happen. And we have pretty much lived through a situation where that has not been feasible. And I was thinking about, when does something like what John just described, waiting for people to tell you they've tested positive and they want to, you have to cancel a performance, where do we reshape possibly society to think about how you have mechanisms that give you enough buffers to be able to continue to function while you still live with a level of uncertainty? How long does it take for a society to adapt? In history, has that happened? Or have we just lived through it and come out the other end and nothing has changed about behavior, about building resilience or planning better? And it just got me thinking about how you would view what you've put together as perhaps preparation for adaptation.
Certainly think that at times of uncertainty, I think different disciplines come together and become more dependent on each other. We are having a discussion today, and the people who worked together on the creation of Contagion Cabaret were from very, very different disciplines and different backgrounds. But I think that there was a sense that the creative artists involved had a useful function in bridging out from the cloistered halls of academia and taking those ideas out into the world in a way that the layperson could digest and encounter them for the first time. But I think also, we as a theatre are incredibly dependent on the benefits of scientists. We have vaccine passports, we have vaccines themselves, we have testing, we have all these things that allows us to continue doing what we're doing only because of scientists. And I think at times of certainty, often these disciplines kind of march in parallel and never really encounter each other. But I think perhaps one of the outcomes of us all being jumbled together through this difficult period is that we start to hear and encounter voices and ideas from different walks of life. And I think the Contagion Cabaret, perhaps in a way, perhaps the way in which it is preparing us for the future is by saying there is value in mixing these things together in a kind of slightly unorthodox, slightly careless, slightly chaotic way. Things will come out of that will be of benefit and interest.
Actually, I had a question for Sally, because she does history of disease and has been for a really long time. When you talk about, again, coming back to uncertainty and to reassurance, you interact with scientists all of the time. Do you, in your framing, feel better once you've spoken to scientists? In other words, is it reassuring for you to get a fuller picture of what happens with pathogens and disease and potentially patterns that have been seen in the past and may reflect what would happen in the future?
Oh, I think absolutely. It's very exciting for me actually to be working with scientists, because you can, when you work historically, you can feel sometimes a bit cut off. That it's absolutely fascinating for you what happened in the past, but quite how it maps onto the present. So to live at this time and to be in constant interaction, and never has science and medicine been so much in the news, which I think is wonderful, that people are actually learning so much more about science and medicine and epidemics than ever before. And to be able to play our part and to show how the thinking that and the processes actually of public health that we're going through now have actually, well, for me, they're created in the 19th century, and for people to realize that and then to be able to take that on board, and vice versa for us to understand how things have evolved now, I've found sort of very inspiring. And I have to say that sort of looking back on the Contagion Cabaret, it now does seem a sort of historic document, because John Frater talking about his experience of working on the ward and leading medics of so many different stripes, actually looking after COVID. But he was speaking at a time when the vaccine seemed impossible virtually, long into the future. And so that sense now of looking at it, at the production again, and seeing that, in fact, we've come a tremendous way. And I think the way in which John decided to finish with Mary Shelley's Last Man, so you've got an apocalypse in the book, which is then transformed into a message of hope. And I think that's what the arts can bring. They can bring both perspective and possibilities, and different forms of emotion.
I know I'm certainly going to watch this again and think of Anna as the virus and see if it changes the way I think about this. But I thought, again, thinking about what might be feasible in India recently, I was talking to somebody about vaccine hesitancy and happened to meet a dancer who is using traditional Tamil dance forms to be able to convey to people what the potential of vaccines is in very resistant communities. So I was just wondering whether you've thought about the different elements that you've incorporated here and had any kind of, I don't know, goal for each part fitting together into a whole. So maybe, John, it would be good to hear from you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the arts in this country at the moment are being asked, in order to sort of survive and receive funding, they're being asked to fill some of the spaces left behind by the reduction of social care, by the sort of shrinking of the welfare state. Arts are increasingly being asked to play a role in health and well-being, in things like social isolation. We have our theatre works on has a process of social prescription. So I'm not sure if that's common in India, but our local health centre can actually prescribe activities that we run. So that might be a dance class for the over 50s, or it might be a creative writing group, or it might be drama for adults with learning disabilities, or whatever it is. They can actually prescribe that, and the health service pays for them to be engaged in that activity. I think it's a big area of growth, and I think quite a challenge for us to think about our impact on the community. And it's always, there's a real split brain on this, because I think most artists and theatre makers recognize that we have to be trying to show that we're making a measurable improvement in our communities. can't rely entirely on the idea that we all think it's a good idea and therefore it's a good idea and therefore we should be funded to do it. We have to sort of try and show that we're improving people's lives and the communities that we live in. But on the other hand, ultimately, artists, and I'm sure this is true of all of the artists who wrote and created the materials that we included in the Contagion Cabaret, it's sort of something that you have to do unilaterally. It's sort of something that you have to do based on the fact that you feel impelled to create something, the fact that you have this drive or this idea or this instinct to say or express in a certain way. And it's the illogicality of that that perhaps separates it and gives it the possibility of offering something different from the sciences at a time like this, because you can just sort of speak from the heart, from the stomach, from the instinct. So it's really interesting trying to juggle those two things. And on the one hand, I might be thinking, well, what can we do with the Contagion Cabaret that might help to educate people? And on the other hand, I'm thinking, well, I'm reliant on science to help me get back to doing something that is very close to my heart and which I want to continue to do, which is to gather people together in the flesh, give them communal experiences that are perhaps different from that which they might receive on their sofa from Netflix. So we're being pulled in those two different directions. So it's an inconclusive answer from me. I think there is value there, but I also think we are kind of duty bound and instinct bound to follow that role as artists as well.
Thank you. I think this might be a good time to pull in some questions from the audience, but we can of course continue to talk to each other, but we'll enrich that by also taking in questions from the audience. Do we already have questions from the audience?
We'll just open the floor. We've just dropped it in the chat box. So
Okay.
we'd really like to encourage the audience to share any questions they might have for any of our amazing discussants in the Q&A box. And Raghavendra, like you suggested, we can continue the discussion, and as questions come in, we'll be able to see them down there.
Okay.
May I ask a question of Deja, Gagandeep and Raghavendra, which is whether there was any parts of the film that seemed less relevant to you from where you're sitting? I'm just really interested to hear what are the things that landed in terms of your own experiences going through the last 2 years, and what are the things that perhaps if we were making the Bangalore remix of the Contagion Cabaret, we might leave out?
Maybe Raghavendra first, and then I'll go.
Yeah. Well, okay. I want to sort of preface this by saying that there is a kind of bias here, because lots of people in India, even the youngsters today, because of our colonial past, are somewhat more familiar with British history, with English history, with English literature, much more than we might have been otherwise. So there is we are sort of pre-programmed to appreciate things that get appreciated in England. So that's a kind of bias. But the only thing that the thing that struck me is that if we were going to make it here, I think we would certainly focus much more on the suffering, especially of the migrant laborers, some of the obvious policy mistakes, avoidable mistakes that were made, and how to avoid them in the future, and what. Of course, India is a huge country, so it's so easy to leave out sections of the population in any discussion. And you may think this is a small section, but in absolute numbers, they run into millions. So there are millions of people who get neglected, even if you leave out a small percentage of the population. So to make anything in India inclusive is hugely difficult. But to see the negative consequences of exclusion are very easy to see. So this is the paradox that we face, being a very, very large and a very heterogeneous country. And that's an angle I think we would certainly like to bring in if we do something from our own perspective. This paradox of in difficulty of being inclusive and the horrors of being exclusive, which is sort of very obvious. Gagandeep, you want to say anything?
Yeah, so for a specific section that I would modify or exclude or shorten maybe is one of the sections on HIV about the labels of being homosexual or being a power broker, right? So I didn't feel like that fitted particularly well with today's context. If it were modified, if we were to think from an Indian perspective about what we would like to include or exclude, I think the biggest difference is that when I talk to people who speak English in India, they are, as Raghavendra said, people who have a very colonial education by and large. It's changing, but hasn't changed that much. So we are probably more familiar with the classics of, English literature than we are with our own. But the difference that I work in communities, I'm a public health researcher. And what I saw in the bulk of the communities that I work with, which is relatively poor people, is quite frankly, the only reason they cared was because they got beaten up by the police for breaking quarantine and because they lost their jobs. And they were not fearful of disease. They were fearful of the consequences of the actions that were being taken in response to the disease.
Really fascinating. Yeah, it's really on both counts, I think, really fascinating to hear. I think probably on the HIV, like you say, the sort of names associated with HIV, I think probably at this moment in time, it's probably less relevant here as well. Although I wonder, as we're now, our government is doing a huge push on people getting a third, what we call a booster jab, and as yet, there are no names invented for people who have been vaccinated and people who haven't been vaccinated. But I wonder if we have this conversation in 12 months' time, if there will start to be that labeling of people who are carriers, people who've had it, people who have been vaccinated, people who haven't. It may be that it will come back into being relevant in our country, in your country, who knows. But it's really, really, really interesting to hear what sits within and without your experience.
Just to say, I've been really fascinated in following through what you were suggesting, Deep, about the Tamil dance and the ways in which one could use traditional forms, because dance is something, we had a bit of dancing, but sort of dance as a folk form, or and thinking about what you could do in terms of traditional Indian culture to rework some of the material, I think would be wonderful.
In fact, not just for dance, but also for music. We've had some of our foremost singers be very engaged in identifying what they think has been relevant and hosting spaces for people to just sit in and listen at a time when very little else is possible. It does require access to technology, and that is a problem for much of our society. But it has been those few moments where you can let go for a while.
I just, not to interrupt, I just wanted to share that there's a question in the from the audience. Raghavendra, would you like to share it, or if all right?
Yeah, do it. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a question from Professor John Matthews. So I think it's really addressed to the entire group. So he's asked that it seems strange that epidemics of influenza have not made it as a major theme for plays or musicals or opera, unlike consumption of cholera, despite the magnitude of loss in, say, the Great Influenza. So why might this be the case? Is such a lack likely to extend to SARS and COVID-19 as well? HIV/AIDS, by contrast, relatively recent as it is, has, of course, Angels in America, Rent, and so on. So maybe what are the thoughts on this, really?
From my point of view, I think it's a question of timing. In the UK, there was a little flurry of theatre writing about the pandemic. And then it suddenly felt very quickly like we had too much of it and that everybody needed to stop writing about it straight away. So I think it's about different perspectives. I think there is a very valid perspective that is right there in the moment. And Contagion Cabaret is perhaps, although it's drawn from historical literature, it could fall into that camp of being a very sort of initial you're in the fog, you can't see the way out, and this is what you're feeling at that moment in time. And then there's another perspective from months or years later when you can offer something different. Certainly, I think most writers, most playwrights probably like to come in at an oblique angle to find something that's new or insightful that they can say about it in a different way. And we consciously didn't use very much material, though we could have, about coronavirus, because it felt like it was actually more imaginative space between Ebola and coronavirus, or the Salem witch trials and coronavirus. Opened up more interesting thinking than if we had just been reflecting back more of what people were getting from the news around them. So I think it will come, but perhaps not quite yet, my feeling.
And just to think about the flu, I think it's quite interesting that there is so little on the flu when sort of other forms of disease have attracted a lot of artistic attention. And I think possibly because flu's never had the negative sort of connotations that some of the other diseases have, and particularly I think why we framed the HIV was because there are strong parallels between getting a sexual disease and the stigma, and having the COVID, the way in which people were treated as pariahs when they'd got it, and being spat on if they were health workers in Britain. So I think there's some interesting issues there around why COVID is seen to be sort of negatively portrayed as opposed to getting the cold or the flu.
Thank you so much, Sally and John, for sharing your thoughts on that. And we had another question or so. So, of course, there's one comment from one of our viewers who themselves are producing a play on the impact of COVID-19 for Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities, and found that your work and the insights that you've all shared today has really helped them in thinking about their own work. And we also have a question from Gabriela Delato, who has asked that, have you considered using this material, which is so brilliant, to open discussions up at the schools, especially high schools level, and or using this, say, in context with teachers as well? So is this something you guys have thought about or have considered?
Well, the answer to that is yes, we have used it with schools, and we had school competitions. And if you go to the original website for Contagion Cabaret, you can see the school submissions, both in art and also written submissions. The winning one in the written submission I thought was quite wonderful. It was set in the future, looking back to COVID times. And it was a time when Omnia, otherwise known or previously known as Amazon, had taken over the world. And the conferences were seen as highly disruptive things. It's rather like Handmaid's Tale. And it actually sort of went through virtually all the materials in the cabaret and rethought about them. So yeah, quite brilliant. But I'd like to do a lot more with working with schools, because I think it's material that we probably sort of parcel up in different ways, but could be, you know, superb material, I think, for and so we'd love to hear about any partners who'd like to participate.
I mean, we have about a few minutes left. So in case anyone else in the audience would like to ask any more questions, we could ask them to share them. But maybe if there are any final thoughts from the panelists before we, you know, close the event, I'd like to just encourage everyone to share them while we have our last few minutes.
I just wanted to ask John in particular, you said this has been evolving. It was born before the actual pandemic hit, and then it changed. Will it continue to evolve?
It certainly seems difficult to shake off. It hangs around, this one. I have no idea, but you know, it would be very interesting to do so. Certainly, I think for me, the idea of it going beyond an English perspective, a UK perspective, I think would be a really interesting direction of travel. You know, this really, today's event and the sharing of this film through your gallery has been a really coincidental happenstance, and not at all part of that post-colonial drift of education and ideas coming from one direction to the other. It would be fascinating to have ideas and prompts and thought-provoking pieces coming down the pipe the other way. It would be lovely to continue that conversation and look at it from some other more global perspectives.
I'd agree with that, and I'll have to start looking for grants that that prioritise in a collaboration between the UK and India.
I think, yeah, that would be something we'd be excited as a gallery to host if we were able to have something like that. I think this is really the mission of a space like this, to be able to bring together people and from all these walks and have them work on something amazing like that. So I'm hoping that some people might be inspired out here by hearing this amazing conversation. And I think this would be a good point then for me to sort of bring the session to a close and thank all of you so much for your time on this Friday evening. Share your thoughts about the performance. And again, I'd also like to encourage those that are here who haven't yet had a chance to see the full performance to absolutely must watch it and also see the exhibition, which has several interesting things that will speak to several parts of the history of pandemics that is mentioned in the play as well. We also have some of the books from which the actors are performing in our reading room in Contagion. So please do go and see those as well. And I would also like to say, if you missed some part of the session, the recording will be up on YouTube, so you can watch the entire discussion. And this is the last weekend, so I'd also like to invite everyone for tomorrow's closing lecture with Vidya Krishnan, Harvard Nieman Fellow and health journalist, who will be talking about science, denialism, and democracy. So it will be a great way for us to end this second phase of Contagion. And I'd like to again thank you all so much for joining us. Thank the audience for being here today with us, and request the audience again for sharing their feedback, sharing their thoughts on the film. So there's a link to a feedback form. Please do drop your thoughts in there. It will help us develop and bring together great people like this again for more public engagement programs for you. So thank you, everyone. Have a lovely weekend.